Elizabeth Swanzy Parker and Awesome Shabazz, but I want to share with you a bit about who we have up here on the stage. So Elizabeth has had the good fortune to apply her systems thinking mind to solve complex business technology challenges with a variety of companies such as Bank of America, Target, Deloitte, and Travelers. Sometimes the challenges that she faced was a banking cybersecurity risk initiative. Sometimes it was as a thought leader driving diversity, equity, and inclusion transparency, or sometimes technology risk management. I should also let you know that Elizabeth is also a Twin Cities Innovation Alliance Fellow. She's a thought leader and a co-powering agent. You'll learn more about her over the course of this fireside chat, but I want you to know that Elizabeth has a superpower, and that superpower is systems thinking. How many of y'all have a superpower with the systems thinking? Yeah, I know there's some system thinkers in here. So her educational background is a bachelor's degree in the urban studies from the University of Connecticut and an MBA from Case Western Reserve University. But let's get a little more personal because we are humans here. So outside of work, she is an advocate for sustainable agriculture. When I read that, I got excited. Doing farm-to-table dining. She's a foodie, a world traveler, historian, and so much more that we're about to learn about now. So Awesome Shabazz is going to have a fireside chat with Elizabeth, and I look forward to the conversation. Thank you all.
Thank you, Marika. So, Elizabeth, welcome.
It's nice to be back in the Twin Cities again. It's been a little while. It's nice to be back.
Yeah, so I know I've had the pleasure of working with you for the past year, and it's been a very dynamic journey just in the space that we've had in the thought leadership. Would you mind sharing with us here a little bit about your origin story, as we've been talking about origin, the history, and remembering that, right? Honoring our history. Talk about your journey. Share with us.
Okay. So my origin story, when I think about who I was and still am from going back to Ghana. I'm a first-generation American. My family is from Ghana and West Africa on both sides. And I've lived there for 4 years of my life. I've gone back and forth over the years. But particularly this past year, July, when I went back, who I see myself and what I thought I was and who my family is significantly changed. And this is where, in terms of origin story and what we've been talking about, particularly in the past panel itself, understanding your history, understanding your family, being able to dig into the family to be able to understand how you are who you are based upon how you've come to this journey through the lines of others who have followed before you. Once you get clarification on that or new insights, how does that help to pave your path moving forward? Sometimes that journey is difficult in terms of the timing of when that information will come out. So one of the things I'm going to share with you is this. I've always seen myself as somewhere between the two sides of the Atlantic as a first-generation American. One foot on the American landscape, another foot on the side of Ghana. And the fusion that has taken place over the years in terms of understanding my identity in America. I'm always seen first as an African American. That's the first label that I get. And I am technically an African American of the first generation, but I'm also across multiple generations in terms of where my family comes from. We're Fantis in Ghana. What does that mean, and things that I've learned. Origin in terms of the matriarchal society and the role that women have. Understanding that a whole lot more on this return trip back and the empowerment that I have as a female, what it is I'm capable of doing and how I help to support other women around me, but also to the men in my family and the multiple generations in the family. That's an origin piece that has become even stronger for me to be able to understand serving community and how and what it is, the legacy that I want to be able to have in terms of empowering people to understand context. Where we are now, that just did not begin here, but being able to look back and see all the different connection points along the way. And so who am I from an origin perspective versus the first generation American cosmopolitan. I see myself as a world citizen. I also see myself living through the immigrant experience. I've worked in cybersecurity and still work in cybersecurity, for example. I've been an internal auditor. I've come through the community development, nonprofit world. I've had many different lives, and my different lives continuing to evolve. It's not over. It just keeps on continuing and growing and becoming more and more rich and complex.
Well, thanks for sharing. The fact that, as you spoke to, the opportunity to see yourself, right, on straddling two continents and the origin story of how you're perceived first and working through that, how does that inform the work that you do today when you think about co-powering in your vision versus the threats that I guess in cybersecurity you would have to continue to have to kind of live on the edge of? How do you navigate that with that? How does it interject?
So one of the key things, especially with the superpower of being a systems thinker, context is always very important, and being able to see across multiple perspectives. I remember my high school history teacher used to tell me the two sides of a coin. It's the same entity, but depending upon which side of the coin it is that you look at, you can have different perspective. And so whenever taking a look at an issue, whatever the problem may be, for good or for bad, being able to take a look at it from two sides of the coin, to be able to have perspective, and also to be able to have appreciation of where the other side may be coming from, you're technically all on the same coin, but it's just where you're coming from and what it is that you see that can help to change the perspective of what's going on. And so in terms of co-powering and moving forward, as we work with different entities within the community, even with individuals, having a conversation with you, for example, understanding where did you come from? Where are the things that have actually impacted you? How did you get here? What were the things that motivated you or maybe dismotivated you to be able to come to this point? Having that in perspective to then understand this is where you are now, and then understanding where it is that you want to be able to move from, that core, that context helps to provide perspective to be able to then figure out how do we merge, how do we create those collaborations and partnerships along the way. Where is your pain? Where is your joy? If I don't know some of those things, we just jump into a conversation or into some type of a collaborative effort, that won't work. And it's also going back to conversations that were taking place in regards to, okay, we have this initiative that's taking place. You only have 3 weeks, 48 hours, 6 months. No, it has to be the longer story, the narrative over time that we need to understand and not forget conveniently, but we got to understand what happened to lead us to this point now.
That's important to carry. When you came back from Ghana, you and I, we had a conversation, and I recall you, the arc of our journey, and you said that when you went back home, you realized we aren't getting the information of what's coming. Mm-hmm. And you thought it was important to connect the two. You said, at some point, I have to connect the two. We have to build these relationships, and we have to deepen it now because it's coming. Mm-hmm. What did you see, and how is it in translating what you see now in this perspective to what you perceive to be in the future that's arriving?
So the last time that I went back to Ghana was 5 years ago, before COVID. And seeing the lens of Ghana, I went in 2016 for my grandmother's funeral, and I thank her for all the great things that she did to help to raise me to be who I am, the values that were passed on. And then in 2018 was the next time that I went. And so with the COVID time period, going back and seeing the resiliency that had occurred in Ghana was absolutely amazing. But it's also too seeing 3 generations of resiliency within the family, but also too with friends. Kofi, if you're on the line, thank you for that reconnection that we've had. It's great to see you and also the new generation of lawyers, solicitors that are coming into the fold, into the industry, into the world. The conversations that we were having, the energy, for example, of seeing what's taking place in Ghana. The architecture, the food scene has evolved to a whole nother level. Fashion, I wish I could help you to see the world that I see or got to see in Ghana that unfortunately on the news stations, you just don't get to see here. So that vibrancy of what is evolving, what is emerging there, there's a strength, there's a resiliency, there's the hope. It just gave me a whole nother level of energy. It's also, there are things I learned about my family's history going back 200 years that I didn't know about. I didn't know we were of Dutch ancestry, and I didn't know we were of Irish ancestry too. So learning about those components of history and how that's tied into colonialism, and how does that change, tied into my surname and my family and the people who are in my family. I discovered my family are really amazing people, but somehow across the cross-Atlantic journey that we made here in the one generation, there are some things that I just did not know. And so there was a great empowerment component that took place, and I'm feeling the strength that has happened. There's also a metamorphosis that occurred during that trip, reconnecting with my family's, the graveyard of my family, and seeing my ancestors and an energy that took place. This is gonna sound very weird, but there was such an energy that took place of being able to connect back to the past. It's given me strength to be able to say I can move forward, and I have the power and I have the ability to be able to impact moving forward.
Thank you for sharing. That's dynamic. You know, you connected the dots. You had this post-COVID. You went in 2016, mercy and grace on the passing of your grandmother, and then you went back in 2018, and now, you know, seeing the resiliency. When you think about the arc, the narrative that you're carrying, and the way that you're seeing technology here evolve, what does that look like if you are charting that visionary course to co-power between the two? What would you say to them right now? Like, what's that journey? What should we expect? What are they able to co-architect there?
So when I think of the technology, and particularly around data, and through this conference the last 2 days, I'm thinking about the origin of data and how that data gets fed into our different AI systems. Yesterday I mentioned the large learning models, which are such critical components in terms of scraping the internet of information, websites for better or for worse, and the technology piece of being able to have the people behind the inputs. When we think about, okay, where am I going to get a data set from, for example? Am I only going to take a look at it in the context of maybe only Minnesota, maybe only the United States, or do I need to look at a larger context to be able to take a look at where that data set of information is going to be coming from?
Can I pause? I just have a question there. Because you say the data set, and I just want to, just for the audience, does everyone know what a data set is? Right? All right. For those who may not, what is the traditional path, and what is the data set? When you say that, because it's feeding these systems, right? What's in that data set? Why is that important?
So I'm going to use the example of facial recognition. And there was, I can't remember the name of the female Google data scientist who helped to, Dr. Joy. Historically, there's a small group of people who help to determine what the facts are. And for better or for worse, based upon their backgrounds, whether they're conscious or unconscious, what actually determines, quote unquote, the facts or the components to build information to then power other levels of information for algorithms that get created from an AI technology perspective, software development, a whole bunch of things. When that data, and I'm going to use my phone, for example, if you think about faces that typically show up on the internet when you do a search. I'm going to do this as simply as happy birthday. I want to do a happy birthday female image so that I can send it off to my girlfriend, my niece, or whoever else it may be. Oftentimes when I do those searches, I don't see a face that looks like mine, like yours, like most of the individuals who are in this room, because they're based on limited data sets, images, of what constitutes the entire population. However, if the data set is more comprehensive to take a look at what is the population of the United States, how does it break down in terms of men and women? How does it break down in terms of socio-demographics or demographics? How does it break down when we say the Black community, African Americans, the Caribbean culture, African culture, combinations in between? The same thing with our Native American populations, our people of Spanish origin, Spanish speaking, our Asian American colleagues, for example, brothers, sisters, and cousins. If you do a much wider span of who those faces are supposed to look like for representation, that is a better sample. But when you only do it of just a small little piece, but not necessarily everything that's on the table itself, it's very limited. So that it does not represent the entire category of possibilities that exist. And so the data set becomes, in my opinion, corrupted because the sample size is too small. And so if we don't open it up to the level that it needs to be, the type of information that the algorithms are going to be feeding on are going to be very limited. And you cannot say that, even though it is often said that this is representative, this is accurate, not necessarily. So from a technology perspective, expansion of what type of data and who is included in the data becomes very critical.
And I'm going to build on that in two ways if I can. Because what you said, I think, is really critical for us to understand that the data that we're feeding into AI, one, has a history of bias. If the sample size is too small, it becomes reflective of that bias. And the way that it's positioned, if I understood you correctly, is that it's positioned as if this is the absolute truth. And then the other side of that, you said that we need to expand that. And that would be the same of our human experience, too. If we're collecting information and we're synthesizing information about one another and broadening our perspectives gives us the opportunity to co-power more effectively. What is the remedy when we started? Because we were talking about data sets, and what would you apply back at home where you in your origin? What do you see as the opportunity there? How would it look from that side of the equation?
So what it will look like, this is where history comes into place, and then whose history comes into place. When I think about what I learned about history up until the period when I went to college versus when I went to college and the additional courses that I took and how much more did I learn that I did not know about. How do we challenge ourselves becomes part of the component. How do we challenge ourselves to expand what we don't know, to be more comprehensive and inclusive is part of the equation that I think comes into play. And so how do we also expose ourselves to more sources of information to help to build the much bigger context of who is being represented at the table?
I'm going to build on that because you said to information, and today, given technology, the small sample size that we have, where you get your information is really important. Do you have any recommendations from a local or global perspective of what you consider to be good sources of information, even if you want to build new data sets, right? Where should we be pulling from to expand that? Because I know that there was some research, and now I'm trying to pull up the facts of it that was used, that AI has been fed off the same corrupted databases, data sets from Berkeley on the West Coast, and then that set has been sold and trained other language models and AI. What, are there any recommendations on how to right-size that, or do we just press the red button and start over?
I start to think about it in terms, for me and my own awareness. I love PBS, and you're going to think this is probably a crazy place to think. But I appreciate how PBS introduces me to different demographics than what I'm used to. Whether it is, for example, Black history, and learning new pieces about history, Black history that I didn't know about, or the Asian American experience with each different month that takes place, or the Hispanic American month. Learn the histories that are forgotten or not told or lost, helping to feed that into my mind in terms of who are we and what is represented in terms of people. That's one piece. It's also, for me, very important to understand there's no such thing as a monolithic component. We love that, particularly in American society. It is either, or the bi sides, like you're either Black or you're white. No, there's shades of gray, and actually they're pink, there's purple, and many other components that come into place. So bringing that into the equation, it is when I think about working at Target, for example, and the ads that they were making, and even seeing that how many years since I left Target in terms of the plurality of the faces that we see. It's even taking a look at this room, for example, as we're having conversations, who's here and who's the conversation with that is taking place. Corporate America doesn't always understand that. Sometimes they do, some elements, not always, but it's also too in the communities as we work with one another side by side. The histories, for example, from like an urban planning perspective. Who came before us? Who's now here with us? What brought us to where we are now? Just taking a look at the other side of the table and being able to say, hi, how are you? How do we engage in conversations? It's not always easy to be able to do. Additional sources that I think about, I tend to not only take a look at American news sources, but I look at The Economist, for example. I look at The Guardian. I take a look at the Hong Kong Japanese station, which I love through my digital antenna. Yes, I'm kind of old school, but it also gives me great information to be able to access different perspectives around the world. So for me, it is always thinking about what are the other shades that are not being considered and in the room. People with disabilities, for example. Who and what does that look like, for example? By neurodiversity, what does that look like, for example? And if that component is brought into a conversation or into a collaboration, what does that entail also? And how much more richer does the conversation become, or the data sets then become?
That's important. I think to build on that, we've been on a journey for the past year, and there's been a lot of thought leadership around AI, the journey. I remember when, I guess you can say when the marketing canon around how powerful ChatGPT 4, I think it is, was at the time, in the race that we heard of every organization, every Fortune 500 company trying to figure out how do we get cash in on this. What are your thoughts? Not your thoughts necessarily. I want to step backwards because that's the next question. How do you see the journey from when we started our conversation and how fast it seems like the needle has moved for us to catch up?
I could not have imagined when we started our conversations, probably sometime around, was it June, July of last year, to this year in the February, March time period with ChatGPT and its evolution, and how much more that has been speeded up. And so, how many people have heard of ChatGPT? Okay, looks like a lot of folks have definitely heard about ChatGPT. There is an awe in terms of wow and amazing and what positive things we can do with it. There's also a scary side in terms of, oh my goodness, how is the technology being used? Again, this becomes the two sides of the coin, for good or for bad. And the evolution of our conversation in regards to the public good side of what ChatGPT could be used for, that part of the conversation seems like it hasn't even gotten out of the gate just yet. And so as we're looking at, okay, how's ChatGPT being used in terms of labor force issues? Who can we replace, for example? That's more of what I'm hearing about. There's another side of my world which I'm not going to quite completely cross into from a work perspective in terms of what we're seeing on the ChatGPT side of things, but particularly from the communal good side, I'm not hearing the conversations taking place just yet. So understanding the technology in terms of, okay, if we're talking about co-powering, for example, and if we're talking about data sets, how do we use ChatGPT? But there are no boundaries that have been created in terms of really good models to create them. How do you, for example, say to ChatGPT, I want you to get this X, Y, and Z information, but you have to even step further back and say, how do I even qualify that information that I'm looking for? If you want to say from an Afro-futurist perspective, I want you to have these particular categories, X, Y, and Z. If you don't really define it very well, what you get back it could be nebulous. How do you know that it's not necessarily accurate? Some things will be, some things will not be. And so that whole dialogue yet in regards to the community and helping to break it down as to what is ChatGPT and its components. How do we write the language and the queries? Do you understand that information is saved? How do you clear that information if you don't realize how it is because it's going to be used by other entities per se? The safeguards that need to be in place, the testing components. There are a lot more components, and it just hasn't taken place just yet.
So let's build on that. You said, the narrative around the public good and how we can dig into that. Also, I was, some of my colleagues, we were talking about the fact that the data gets corrupted over time because of the way it's fed. It actually has a life cycle that if it's not constantly updated, it will actually start to break down internally. The thought is, the question, if we're not hearing the narrative about how we want it, is it not infused with our values right now? What values are being represented in the space compared to the co-power, communal, regenerative, renewal values of our community, which has been a spark of our conversation since we've been here?
So I always think of the algorithms of the internet. Who gets pushed to the top, who winds up being down at the bottom. And so the type of topics that are being pushed up to the top will tend to be the loudest, noisiest entities, good or bad, marketing purposes, branding purposes. It could be just for some generic artistic purposes. But when we start to, it's also the misinformation and disinformation pieces that we're starting to see a lot of. But in terms of this audience and topics that are very important, how much of that is being pushed up in terms of the internet algorithms? So I think that there is that opportunity to be able to do so, to start to feed. If you want to use ChatGPT, for example, how do we help to put in, for example, like a catalog, as I'm taking a look at Tanya, and the list that you help to put onto the screen in terms of books to take a look at, and authors, for example. I think that needs to also be fed in, but it also becomes a numbers game to be able to help to point to the right sources of where to get to that information.
So then I think that points to the need for us to validate what the good sources that we should point it to, and also to build in the values that we want to see espoused through it. I've I've read that the manipulation and the counter chat GPTs that have ulterior motives have actually been on proliferation, and there's still no framework around it. Is that correct?
And again, I have to be careful for my work boundaries, how much of that I can talk about, but that is true. So coming back to the two sides of a coin, the good and the bad. ChatGPT can be used for good, ChatGPT can be used for bad. And it is amazing. It just depends upon what your intentions are and what you can think of what you can use it for. How do you even turn the quote-unquote safeguards around? So instead of using a conditional statement in this way, you just kind of flip it that way, and how you actually break some of the quote-unquote safeguards in terms of you can't do this and you shouldn't be able to do that. But it's possible.
That's to the point where Dr. Stevie Chancellor was talking about yesterday, that a lot of the safeguards, even in the current mechanisms that we have, can be tricked with minimal effort.
Yeah.
I know we're about to wrap up, and so I wanted to, as we talked about that co-power and the narrative, what's some opportunities that you would, say to our audience that for them to engage either, their sense of agency? A lot of them are college students, they're starting out, and this seems big and nebulous. What feedback would you give them?
So to everyone who is here, to the little girl who is right over there, hi. To those of the different generations and different industries in which we work with, I think we have got to take on the tech side in terms of don't be afraid of it. So whether it's as simple as a YouTube video, please help me to understand my phone. One thing, like how many of you actually know all the different features that are on your different phones? Okay.
I take pictures with it.
You take pictures with it, okay, which is great. But there's such power here, the mini computers that we carry around with us, but also to the amount of data that we feed in that we don't realize. Every piece of information that you put in, think of it as data currency. There's a value for it. you log on to a particular web browser, for example, they love your information. You may not think that it's actually important in terms of where you are geographically. They want that information. It's called an IP address. When you update your phones in terms of the security updates or don't, that becomes another piece of data that someone can use against you, or it could help to protect you. So think of it as your vaccine. I have to be an advocate for that in terms of you also need to protect the data on your phone in terms of the flu, COVID, whatever else it may be. Learn how to use your phone to be able to update those security settings. Otherwise, you're making yourself vulnerable. And when you make yourself vulnerable because you're not doing those vaccines and security updates, the data that resides on your phone, your wallet, if you put your credit card information here to be able to go to a website, you put in information. Please don't put your social security numbers, but if you have to, you're doing online banking, if you're doing shopping and other details like that, every bit of that is data, your data currency. So how do you protect it is very important, and these are some of the things that we need to learn to understand. I'll be glad to talk to you a bit further after the call, or after the call. We will have further calls to be able to discuss this, but after the conference itself, in terms of what do I need to know, what are some of the little things that I need to know to be able to protect myself. One last basic thing, Bluetooth on your phone. It is automatically on at any point in time for you to be able to connect to X, Y, and Z. It's one of the worst things that you can have on your phone if you do not need it, and it can be hijacked. Turn Bluetooth off on your phone. So these are some of the little things to start to protect us, the devices that we use to be able to access information, what data we are actually providing.
I'm seeing people looking to see if their Bluetooth is on right now.
We'll talk. We'll talk about that. But it becomes important for all of us to start to learn, like, what do we need to do to help to protect our data? Value your data, your name, your phone number, your address, your email address, credit card numbers, a whole bunch of different things. Someone out there, for better or for worse, loves your information, is using your information, whether you realize it in the here and now, they're doing so. So that's the first step as we talk about the technology side that we need to learn.
Yeah, and in closing, I think those are important steps. In the world of computer science and IT, the convenience is the highest risk, right? And people love convenience. The convenience of most of the platforms that give you, that utilizes your data, that you give away for free, and that has a high value, it's the convenience of it. The more secure your device is, your pocketbook, your wallet is, the less convenient it is to access, the more restrictive and safer technically it is. We have to co-power ways of how do we design it, right, from the inception point to balance out the convenience and the risk and reorientate ourselves. Often I get, I'm not hiding anything. They already have my data. And then I say, well, you have a purse that's closed and covered up. You don't have a see-through purse. Consider your phone to be the same thing. Any tips and tricks on how to shift our mindset? Because I think sometimes the lift of being secure today in this digital age becomes such a burden that people stop wanting to worry about it. Like, it seems too big. How do we help people right-size it as we get ready to close the conversation out? How can we make it easier?
This is where I say the value of your data, you have no idea how important it is. And I'm trying to figure out a really good way of explaining that you can't say there's nothing that I can do. There are some components that you won't be able to control, but there are components that you absolutely can control. Again, what websites do you go to? What type of business are you doing on those websites? Do you log off of your laptop or your phone periodically? Like, literally shut it down, clear out your web history, or is it forever and ever and ever, everything is just going? Literally, like, it's house cleaning. It's called hygiene, your web or digital hygiene. So clear out your browsers every once in a while. It messes up a few folks along the way who are tracking you with all those different cookies and other things. But it's okay. Reset that for them so that they have to start all over. That's probably like one of the key things that I'm going to say in regards to that. House clean and dusting is good. Getting rid of the cobwebs on your digital tracking is a good thing to do.
So, and as we get ready to close out, I think it is accept some inconvenience, accept some hardship, do some hygiene, and start looking at ways of protecting ourselves with data. And this is from a security perspective. There is a little bit of inconvenience because sometimes when it gets ready to say clear the cache, it's like, oh, all your passwords and everything. And I'm like, do I really want to put it on my passwords all over again? Mm-hmm. And for me, I'm like, yeah, I'm gonna hit that. But I know MJ's like, yeah, awesome. Yeah, every device we have is like overly encrypted if we can. So there's definitely a trade-off. Well, we're gonna close out. Elizabeth, want to thank you for your time.
Thank you.
And everyone else. Thank us for co-powering this. Have a good one. Peace.